The discovery of a grisly crime scene. It was a cold, overcast November morning in Burlington, Vermont, the kind of morning where the air was sharp enough to bite, and the dense fog from Lake Champlain blanketed the outskirts of town like an unsettling shroud. Early risers were just beginning their routines. Among them was Ethan Calhoun, a retired postal worker, who often started his day with a brisk walk in the nearby wooded area off Pine Brook Road. As he made his way through the empty trail, Ethan noticed something peculiar by a clearing near an overgrown ditch. A large, worn-out suitcase sat abandoned in the open, its dark leather exterior dotted with scuffs and dirt. Being Vermont, where impromptu thrift drop-offs weren't uncommon, Ethan assumed it was just someone getting rid of an old piece of luggage. But as he drew closer, an instinctive chill ran down his spine. The suitcase was partially unzipped. Something about it felt wrong. It wasn't the musty smell of abandonment or the faint metallic tang lingering in the air that set him off. It was the small streak of red near the zipper. A rust stain perhaps, or no, was that blood? Ethan, feeling a mix of dread and curiosity, reluctantly leaned in for a closer look. His shaking hands tugged at the zipper, pulling it back just enough to glimpse the contents inside. What he saw made him stumble backward, his breath lodging in his throat. Inside the suitcase were fragments of what unmistakably looked like human body parts, wrapped hastily in plastic with streaks of dried and fresh blood intermingling. An arm, pale, stiff, and grotesquely bent, jutted out at an unnatural angle. Ethan's knees buckled. The blood left his face as he stumbled away and reached for his cell phone with trembling fingers. 911, what's your emergency? Came the calm voice of the dispatcher. There's a body here. Oh my God, Ethan stammered. A chopped-up body, in a suitcase, Jesus Christ! The dispatcher's tone sharpened. Sir, please remain calm. Can you tell me your exact location? By the time the Burlington police arrived, the scene had already begun to draw attention. Word traveled fast in small towns like these, and curious onlookers had gathered around the yellow police tape as officers carefully assessed the grisly discovery. Detective Sarah Whitaker, known for her tenacity and an unflinching resolve in dealing with crimes most would shy away from, was the lead on the case. She arrived about 15 minutes after the suitcase was officially reported. The moment Sarah laid eyes on the scene, she knew this wasn't going to be a simple case. No runaway suitcase dumped as an afterthought. This was personal. The level of brutality, the methodical sealing of body parts in plastic, spoke of a chilling deliberateness behind the crime. "Secure the perimeter!" Sarah barked at her team as she knelt beside the suitcase, careful not to disturb the evidence. Her gloved hand hovered over the contents for a moment before she took a deep breath. This wasn't just random. Someone wanted this to be found but not easily traced. Nearby, a search dog handler called out, "We found some tracks leading into the woods. Barely visible but fresh. Could have been from the perp or someone disposing of the evidence," Sarah interjected, completing the handler's sentence. She stood up and scanned the onlookers standing just beyond the tape. Their faces painted a wide spectrum of confusion, curiosity, and utter horror. Small-town Vermont wasn't used to this kind of crime. Husbands murmured reassurances to wives, and parents clutched their children a little tighter. Ethan, the man who had discovered the suitcase, sat on the edge of an ambulance, shivering despite being wrapped in a heavy blanket. The suitcase and its grim contents were carefully collected and transported to the forensics lab. Meanwhile, Sarah instructed her team to search the surrounding woods thoroughly. Whoever had done this had to have left something, a footprint, a trail, anything that could serve as a clue. This kind of crime wasn't done on a whim. It required both deviance and preparation, two things that could be traced back to the perpetrator. By the time the news reached the local media, the nickname, the Pine Brook Suitcase Murder, was plastered across Vermont's airwaves. What began as a quiet, dreary morning in Burlington suddenly became the epicenter of a grotesque mystery. As Sarah stared down at the bare patch of dirt where the suitcase had been, one question loomed louder than the murmurings of the crowd behind her. Who could be capable of something like this, and why? The victim and the mystery. The first step in unraveling any case is identifying the victim. Detective Sarah Whitaker stood in the cold, dimly lit forensics lab later that evening, sipping on a now lukewarm cup of coffee. Before her lay the grim contents of the suitcase, now carefully examined and catalogued by the forensic team. The silence of the lab was punctured only by the hum of the fluorescent lights above. A sense of urgency loomed overhead. The quicker the victim was identified, the closer they would be to understanding the why, and critically, the who. Lead medical examiner, Dr. Elaine Graves, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had seen her fair share of gruesome cases, approached Sarah with a solemn expression. She carried a clipboard filled with notes and photographs of the remains. "Sarah, we've begun piecing together what we can. We're nearly certain the victim is a woman," Elaine began, taking a moment before continuing. "Based on the body size, bone structure, and the remains we recovered, she's likely in her early 30s, Caucasian. But distinguishing facial features, there's nothing left. The head was intentionally obscured. It's going to take more than a cursory glance to name her." Sarah grimaced, setting her coffee aside. "Obscured how?" Elaine sighed. "The features were either removed with a sharp tool or deliberately mangled, likely to evade identification. The cuts, they were clean. This wasn't some clumsy operation. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Sarah leaned in, studying a series of photographs pinned on the nearby corkboard. "This level of precision, this isn't first-time work." Elaine nodded. "Exactly. This doesn't scream spur-of-the-moment rage. This was planned, meticulously. It wasn't about the act of killing, it was about making her disappear." The conversation was interrupted by the lab assistant, Eric, who hurried in holding a sealed, clear evidence bag. Inside was a small, bloodied bracelet found in the folds of the suitcase. It was delicate, with a simple silver charm that had a small inscription, "Patty." Could this be hers? Eric wondered aloud, handing the bag to Sarah. Sarah carefully examined it through the plastic. "Patty. Could be a nickname, or the victim's actual name. Get this cleaned up and sent for DNA testing. If it's hers, or if there's any trace of the suspect on it, I want to know yesterday." "Already on it," Eric said, before disappearing back into the room full of whirring forensic machines. As the evening stretched into the early hours of the next day, Sarah pored through missing person reports, cross-referencing details about any local women named Patty or Patricia who had disappeared in the past several weeks. The suitcase screamed a certain degree of local familiarity. After all, Burlington wasn't the kind of town where outsiders blended in unnoticed. That hunch proved correct by early morning when Eric called Sarah back into the lab with some preliminary results. "We've got something," Eric announced, gesturing toward a screen where a match lit up in the missing persons database. DNA pulled from one of the victim's remaining fingernails came back with a hit. Her name is Patricia Miller, 32 years old, lives or lived on Maplewood Drive just outside town. Sarah jotted down the address, her heart sinking. Maplewood Drive was lined with quaint two-story homes, white picket fences, and trees that turned brilliant shades of red and orange in the fall. It was practically postcard perfect, a far cry from the horror show they'd uncovered in the Pine Brook woods. "What do we know about her?" Sarah asked, her detective instinct kicking into overdrive. Eric tapped a few keys, pulling up Patricia's file. She was reported missing 3 days ago by a friend, a Wendy Collins. No spouse listed in the report, but... Wait. He leaned closer to the monitor. "There's a note about a separation from her husband, David Miller, a few months ago." Eric looked up. "That's probably worth checking into." "It always is," Sarah muttered, grabbing her coat off the back of the chair. "Get me the friend's contact details, and let's pull everything we can find on David Miller. I have a feeling we'll be hearing more of his name soon." The home on Maplewood Drive. Later that morning, Sarah and her partner, Officer Greg Yates, arrived at Patricia's last known residence on Maplewood Drive. The house sat eerily still, its blinds drawn even though the sun was already climbing high. A child's bicycle lay tipped over just outside the porch, a ghost of normalcy that contrasted sharply with the grim reality Sarah had walked into. After knocking twice with no response, Greg carefully opened the unlocked front door, announcing their presence. "Burlington PD, is anyone home?" The silence inside was deafening. The living room was tidy, though the air felt stale, as if it hadn't been lived in for days. Sarah examined the room, her sharp eyes scanning for anything out of place. Her gaze landed on a pile of mail stacked neatly on the coffee table. Bills, magazines, but no sign of a letter or message suggesting Patricia had planned to leave. In the kitchen, Sarah found something more unsettling. A calendar. The page was open to November and several dates were circled in red. One of them, November 7th, had Jess scrawled lightly in the corner. "Jess," Sarah murmured. "Could be a friend, family? Or someone else entirely," Greg said from the hallway, where he was thumbing through framed family photos. He pointed to a picture showing Patricia and a younger woman with similar features. "Could this be Jess?" Possibly, Sarah said, snapping a quick photo of the framed image with her phone. We might have just found our first connection to her personal life outside the husband. Let's see if Wendy mentions her when we talk to her. The first piece of the puzzle was coming together, but Sarah knew this was only the start. Patricia's identity was only one layer of the mystery. The real question was why, and who, and judging by the careful mutilation of her body, one thing was certain. Whoever murdered Patricia had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury the past. Early suspicions begin to stir. As the fog of mystery surrounding Patricia Miller's murder thickened, Detective Sarah Whitaker knew one thing for sure. Cases like these always started at home. People rarely end up chopped into pieces inside a suitcase unless they knew their killer. Sarah's gut told her this was no random act of violence, it was personal. And like all personal crimes, someone in Patricia's orbit was hiding something. Back at Burlington PD's investigation unit, Sarah stood in front of a whiteboard now covered with photos, timelines, and a map of the surrounding areas. The suitcase discovery at Pinebrook Woods was marked with a red pin. Patricia's home on Maplewood Drive, another red pin. Strings of yarn connected places, dates, and possible suspects, though the connections were still as cloudy as the November skies. Her partner, Greg Yates, leaned against the doorway, flipping through a stack of newly pulled records. "All right, Sarah," Greg said, his voice low and dry. "We've got two glaring names that keep coming up like bad pennies. David Miller, her estranged husband, and Jessica Carter, her kid sister." Sarah nodded. "Figures. The ex and the sister. Classic suspects in this kind of mess. What do we know so far on them?" Greg raised a single brow as he tossed the records onto the desk. "David's been off the radar for weeks. Nobody's seen him since before Patty was reported missing by her friend Wendy. And get this, the lovely Mr. Miller filed for bankruptcy 6 months ago after his contractor business tanked. Talk about stress, huh?" Greg tapped a finger on Patricia's photo. "He moved out of their house on Maplewood right after things went south financially, but there's no formal divorce on file. Word around town is Patty was still thinking it over. Hell, maybe she even wanted to patch things up." Sarah crossed her arms. "And Jess? What's the story there?" "Jessica Carter, 24, unemployed, a bit of a drifter. She's been couch surfing since she lost a waitressing gig last spring. Neighbors say she moved in with her older sister a few months back to get her life together. But, surprise, surprise, there was a lot of tension between her and Patricia." Greg smirked darkly. Apparently Patty wasn't too thrilled about Jessica's habit of sleeping until noon and bringing home a questionable boyfriends. "And they were all living in the same house?" Sarah asked, quirking a skeptical brow. "Patricia, David, assuming he was still coming back now and then, and Jessica, sounds like a pressure cooker waiting to blow." Greg shrugged. "If David was ever there after he officially moved out, nobody stepped forward to confirm it. But neighbors swear they saw his car parked outside the Maplewood house, more than once since August. And here's the kicker." He flipped a page in the case file and slid it across the desk towards Sarah. "A neighbor named Mrs. Granger claims she overheard some colorful arguments between all three of them last month. Patty, Jess, and David were fighting about none other than, ta-da, money." Sarah exhaled sharply, leaning back in her chair. "Let me guess, David wanted more of it. Patty wouldn't give it, and Jess probably needed it." "Pretty much," Greg confirmed. "Mrs. Granger specifically recalls the words freeloader and get out of my life being yelled loud enough to echo across the cul-de-sac." The growing shadow over Maplewood Drive. The hunch grew stronger as Sarah interviewed Wendy Collins, Patricia's closest friend, and the one who had filed the missing person report. Wendy sat stiffly in the police station's interrogation room, clutching her purse as though it might shield her from the weight of the situation. Her eyes darted nervously around the room until Sarah sat across from her, turning on that professional yet gentle tone that she reserved for particularly frightened witnesses. "Wendy," Sarah began, folding her hands neatly on the table between them, "you did the right thing coming forward when Patty didn't answer your calls. Can you tell me in your own words, how worried were you?" Wendy's voice came out shaky. "Very worried. Patty was a creature of habit, you know. She had this schedule, morning yoga, grocery shopping every Thursday, Sunday lunch at my place. When she didn't show up last Sunday I thought, maybe she was sick, but by Tuesday no calls, no texts, nothing. I knew something was wrong." Sarah nodded slowly. "Did she mention anything recently that gave you pause? Something about her husband, her sister?" Wendy chewed on her lower lip for a moment. "There were tensions, but there always were. Patty was private about David, but I knew things were bad between them. He had a temper, Sarah. I mean, he never hit her, not that she told me, but he could be cruel, dismissive. And Jessica, Patty loved her sister and please don't think badly of her for saying this, she was kind of a screw-up. Sometimes Patty talked like she didn't know how much more she could take having Jess in her house. Sarah scribbled something in her notebook. Did Patty ever say she felt unsafe? Did she mention being afraid of either of them, David or Jessica? Wendy hesitated, then shook her head. Not directly, but she did say something interesting a few weeks back. She said, "Everything feels heavier lately, like I can't breathe in my own home." When I asked what she meant, she just laughed it off and said she was probably overthinking things. But the way she smiled? It felt forced. I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into it now that Wendy's voice cracked. "You're not," Sarah assured her. "You did the right thing coming forward." David and Jessica, missing, or hiding. As Sarah and Greg pieced through Patricia's increasingly tangled web of family dynamics, a troubling discovery emerged. David and Jessica were both conspicuously absent. A quick search into their financial and phone records revealed no recent activity, no credit card transactions, no cell phone pings. It was as though they had evaporated from Burlington's quiet streets. "All right, Sarah," Greg said as he stood in front of the whiteboard, tapping David and Jessica's photos with a marker. "We've got two key players, both MIA, and both with motives, money in David's case and, hell, I don't know what Jessica's deal is, resentment, jealousy, or worse," Sarah added, glancing at the suitcase photo pinned just above the two suspects' pictures. "Maybe it's something darker than either of us wants to admit right now." The team's first steps were clear: locate David Miller and Jessica Carter as quickly as possible. Were they running because they were scared, or because they had something to hide? Either way, Sarah couldn't shake the gut feeling gnawing at her since she'd first stood over that blood-stained suitcase. Whatever had exploded inside that family was deeper and deadlier than anyone had yet realized. Evidence at the scene. The woods surrounding Pinebrook Road had always carried an eerie quality, especially on days when fog lingered and sunlight barely penetrated the thick canopy. But on this particular November morning, the unsettling quiet seemed to wrap itself around Detective Sarah Whitaker and her team as they combed through the area where the suitcase had been found. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the occasional gusts of wind, cordoning off a patch of dirt that might have otherwise gone unnoticed among the foliage. The suitcase was gone, safely transported to the forensic lab, but detectives knew well enough that killers rarely left just one piece of the story behind. "All right, people," Sarah's voice rang out across the clearing as she stood with her hands on her hips, gloves on and ready to dig in. "I want this area swept, every inch. I don't care if what you find looks insignificant. Pill wrappers, cigarette butts, footprints, bag it, tag it, and get it back to the lab." The scent of damp earth mingled with the metallic tang of blood that still lingered faintly in the air. Officer Greg Yates stepped carefully around the clearing, his boots crunching against twigs and dry leaves. At the far end of the taped-off area, a police dog handler crouched low, studying the way the German shepherd's nose dragged rhythmically across the ground. "Tracks!" the handler finally called out, standing and gesturing toward a faint indentation in the dirt. "Looks like someone walked this way. Barely visible but fresh." Greg squinted at the ground, following the direction of the handler's point. These could be from the perp, or someone dumping the evidence. He shot Sarah a knowing look. She nodded, crouching beside the faint tracks. The spacing and depth of the impressions weren't much, but they were something. "Let's get a cast of these," she ordered. "If this bastard left us a footprint, I want to know the brand, size, and every damn detail about the shoes he or she was wearing." Meanwhile, two officers knelt near the overgrown ditch, where something else had caught Sarah's eye earlier, a dark streak trailing from where the suitcase had been found deeper toward the edge of the woods. It wasn't large, but it stood out starkly against the pale dirt. A smear of something sticky, rust-colored, and all too familiar. "Blood?" one of the officers muttered, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves. Sarah was already on her knees beside them, pulling out a flashlight to examine the area more closely. "Could be, or maybe it's transfer from the suitcase when it was dragged here." She glanced toward the ditch, the foliage here clearly disturbed. "But if it's blood and it's fresh, it might belong to our victim, or even our suspect. Get a sample, and check for any other smears, drops, or trails. If they left a breadcrumb for us, we can't afford to miss it." "Got it," one officer responded, carefully swabbing the reddish substance into a small vial before sealing it in a plastic evidence bag. Discovery of suspicious items. As the team expanded their search outward, more clues began to emerge. About 15 yards from the original drop site, an officer yelled out, Detective Whitaker! Got something over here! Sarah and Greg stepped quickly over the uneven forest floor, ducking under branches until they reached the officer, who stood holding a plastic bag with its contents half spilled. A crumpled bundle of what appeared to be disposable rubber gloves. Inside the crumpled plastic were a few bloodstains, faint but undeniable. Looks like someone had cleanup on their mind, Greg muttered, his mouth tightening into a line. Why ditch this here though? Seems sloppy. It's arrogance, Sarah replied, pulling out her phone to take a few pictures. They probably thought no one would find this. Or worse, they didn't care. Maybe they assumed the suitcase would be the only thing people would focus on. Got more over here! Came another shout, this one closer to the clearing. Sarah pivoted as an officer held up a bent kitchen knife, the blade dulled and nicked in a way that made her stomach churn. The handle was stained with something that could have been dirt, but a closer look suggested otherwise. Jesus, Greg said under his breath, do you think? Bag it. Handle it like it's made of glass, Sarah said sharply. She could feel the gravity in her chest, the sense that these seemingly ordinary objects were all puzzle pieces waiting to snap into place, painting a picture far darker and more twisted than any of them wanted to admit. A telling trail. As the hours stretched on, the search party expanded their examination to the edges of the dirt road, where the faint lines of tire tracks finally captured their attention. The track marks were uneven but fresh, pressed deep by the weight of a vehicle carrying a heavy load. Sarah crouched down and carefully ran her gloved fingers along the tread marks. Looks like a mid-sized sedan, Sarah said thoughtfully, her voice low. Tires look pretty common, not a big flashy SUV or truck. Makes sense if our guy or gal was trying to be inconspicuous. Hard to narrow it down just from that though, Greg said, kneeling beside her. Half the cars in Vermont are probably sedans, and who knows how many have passed this area recently. Maybe so, Sarah said, scanning her surroundings. But this person didn't pick this spot by accident, Greg. They knew just how far off the beaten path they had to go. Too far for hikers, too remote for joggers. Whoever we're dealing with had done their homework. They're careful, or they thought they were. Greg glanced at her, smirking despite the grim situation. You sound like you almost admire them. It's not admiration, Sarah shot back. It's anger. Arrogance like this has a way of catching up to people. Nearby, the search team uncovered another key clue. A pile of torn plastic bags, one with what appeared to be streaks of cleaning detergent. It was as if the killer had deliberately disposed of their tools one by one, a makeshift trail that only sharpened Sarah's instincts. A disturbance in the woods. By early evening, the team had amassed a growing collection of evidence. The suitcase had been central, of course, and now it was joined by gloves, a knife, shattered trail debris, bloody smears, and tire tracks. But the question lingered, and Sarah could feel it gnawing at her gut. Why here? She muttered to herself as she stood among the towering trees. The sky above them was beginning to darken, the air cooling. Why was this spot chosen? Why not burn it? Why not bury it? Greg stood nearby, tugging his jacket tighter against the chill. Maybe they wanted it to be found. Sarah turned to him sharply, her eyes narrowing. It was a grim thought, but one that made too much sense. Or maybe they didn't care if it was found, or maybe... She paused, her voice growing quieter. Maybe they wanted us to find it, but not find them. As that realization settled over the clearing, Sarah's resolve hardened. All right, she said, turning to the growing pile of bagged evidence carefully laid out near the tape. Send all of this to the lab, every single piece, and tell the team at the station to start cross-referencing every tire mark and brand we've got records for. We'll find them, Greg. We're already close. Close is good, Greg said, standing up. But not good enough. As the wind whistled through the forest and the stakes of the investigation grew sharper, Sarah couldn't help but feel that their suspect was watching and waiting. Complicated family conflicts. The deeper Detective Sarah Whitaker dug into Patricia Miller's life, the more it became apparent that this wasn't just a crime. It was a symphony of mounting tension, betrayal, and broken bonds. Families often held secrets, but this one seemed to be built on them. Back at the station, Sarah sifted through notes from her interviews as Greg Yates entered the room, balancing a takeout cup of black coffee in one hand and a burgundy file folder in the other. Ready for some good old-fashioned family drama? Greg asked as he dropped the folder onto Sarah's desk. He flopped onto the chair across from her, his bulky frame looking almost too big for the office furniture. I got some dirt on the Miller-Carter household, and let me tell you, it's a train wreck. Sarah arched a brow and reached for the folder. What angle are we talking here? Petty sibling fights or full-blown dysfunction? Greg let out a low whistle as he kicked back in his chair. Oh, it's dysfunction, all right. I mean, we're talking a perfect little cocktail of resentment, bad decisions, and financial stress. Let's start with the Jessica situation, shall we? Sarah opened the file as Greg continued. So, Jessica Carter, your classic train wreck little sister. She's 24, no steady job, no ambition from what I've heard. Gets a waitressing gig, loses it after a couple of months, moves in with her older sister, you know, the responsible one, to get her life back on track. But surprise, surprise, it doesn't go well. Let me guess, Sarah said, leaning back in her chair. Jessica takes advantage of Patricia's kindness. Greg nodded, twirling his pen. Exactly. According to Wendy, the best friend, you know how family freeloaders work. Jessica moves in, promises she'll find a job, but instead she spends most days sleeping until noon and bringing around these loser boyfriends. Patricia apparently tried to tackle it with patience, but the fights started piling up. Jessica would get defensive every time Patricia brought up money or asked her to contribute. You know how these things go. Let me guess, Sarah sighed, rubbing at her temples. Jessica starts playing on Patricia's guilt. Bingo, Greg said, pointing his pen at her. And apparently Jessica was damn good at it. All that you're supposed to help me or mom would have wanted you to take care of me type of crap. Patricia, being the rule follower, the older sister with the savior complex, just couldn't stand the idea of kicking her out, but it came at a cost. Sarah tilted her head, studying the open file. And how does David fit into this whole mess? Oh, David, Greg said with a dry chuckle. He's the real kicker in all this, isn't he? The Golden Boy contractor turned walking disaster. Guy's business went belly up 6 months ago, took their finances with it. Patricia still had her savings and some inheritance from their dad, but, and get this, David took it as his God-given right to dip into that when things went south. Patricia must have put her foot down at some point, but by then tensions were already lighting up like fireworks. Sarah let out a low exhale. So, we've got a husband drowning in resentment over money and a little sister eating away at Patricia's sanity. That's a lot of pressure for one person. Oh, it gets better, Greg said as he slid a new photo across the desk. It was of Jessica and David standing suspiciously close at a neighborhood barbecue several months ago. Sarah's eyes narrowed. You're telling me, Greg smirked. Yep, he said, leaning forward dramatically like he was revealing the plot twist in a thriller. The whispers around the cul-de-sac weren't about what a lousy husband David was or how reckless Jessica could be. They were about how close the two of them were getting when Patricia wasn't around. Wendy didn't want to say it outright, but between the arguing and Jessica suddenly becoming David's biggest cheerleader every time he was around, the neighbors had their suspicions. So, he's financially tied to Patricia, Sarah began, pacing the room as she pieced the scenario together. Jessica's leeching off Patricia, but then she and David, what? Share some sort of sick bond? A mutual hatred of Patricia, maybe, or something more? Could be something more, Greg replied darkly. Or it could just be manipulation. Jessica and David both had their reasons to feel like Patricia was standing in the way of their happiness. And isn't that always the way? Turn on the person trying to keep it all together. Sarah stopped pacing and stared at the board on the wall, now plastered with photos of the three. Patricia, standing tall and graceful, the evident matriarch of this broken unit. David, whose face was shadowed in guilt and frustration in every candid shot, and Jessica, grinning with a half-drunk glint in her eye in most photos. Patricia never complained to authorities, though, Sarah noted. Even with all this brewing under her roof, she never called the cops, never filed a report. Greg shrugged. Maybe part of her thought she could fix it, or maybe, he tapped Patricia's photo. Maybe she didn't want to admit how messy things had gotten. People like her, they hold on until it's too late. The tipping point. Through more conversations with Wendy Collins and nosy neighbors, Sarah started to see a clearer picture of what must have been the breaking point. Wendy mentioned one explosive fight 2 weeks before Patricia's disappearance when Patricia reportedly screamed at Jessica to pack her things and leave the house. She was crying when we had lunch the next day, Wendy had told Sarah. She said she felt like a failure, like no matter what she did it wasn't good enough for David or Jessica. But then she laughed it off, you know, said I shouldn't worry, that she could handle the stress. God, I wish I had pushed harder. Neighbors, too, recalled arguments that could be heard echoing down the street late at night, most of them about money. Patricia accusing Jessica of being a freeloader. Jessica accusing Patricia of being controlling. David shouting about being the man of the house while leaving his dirty work boots on Patricia's meticulously clean floors. And now they've both conveniently vanished into thin air, Sarah muttered to herself as she stared at the tangled web of connections on the board. Tell me that doesn't scream guilt, Greg. Oh, it screams guilt, Greg agreed, the kind of guilt you try to outrun. As the clock ticked forward, the question that hung over the investigation wasn't just who hated Patricia Miller enough to kill her, it was who broke first, and why. David and Jessica vanish. The disappearance of David Miller and Jessica Carter wasn't just odd, it practically screamed guilt. For Detective Sarah Whitaker, it was one of those moments in a case that rang every alarm bell in her investigator's brain. People involved in messy family disputes didn't just vanish unless they had something to hide. And yet, in the days following the discovery of Patricia Miller's body, the two people most connected to her were nowhere to be found. It was late afternoon when Sarah barged into the station's conference room, a styrofoam cup of black coffee in one hand and a file folder in the other. Greg Yates was already seated at the table, his feet propped up, eating from a bag of pretzels. She dropped the folder in front of him with a heavy thud. "Tell me what we've got, Greg. Where the hell are these two?" Greg dusted crumbs from his lap and sat up straight, fishing a sheet of paper out of the folder. "All right, so here's the rundown. David has been off the grid since Patricia's friend Wendy reported her missing. His phone hasn't pinged anywhere local, no credit card transactions, no ATM withdrawals. The last known trace of him was about 8 days ago, pulling cash from an ATM downtown. After that, poof, like the guy's a ghost." "And Jessica?" Sarah asked, crossing her arms as she leaned against the table. "Same deal," Greg said, shaking his head. "No phone pings, no social media hits, nothing. And believe me, a girl like Jessica leaves a trail when she's bored. Shopping, binge drinking, all the crap 20-somethings do to blow off steam, none of that's happening. It's eerie." Sarah frowned and tapped her fingers against the table. "This isn't just them running off for a weekend trip, Greg. Pair that with David's SUV seen multiple times parked near the Pinebrook Woods and neighbors talking about heated arguments at that house. This disappearance doesn't feel like coincidence. It feels deliberate." Greg nodded. "I dug into their bank records. Guess what? David drained his account 6 days ago. Not much in there, about $800. And Jessica? Zero. Whatever she had, she's not touching it." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "If they're running, why aren't they spending? Where are they hiding?" The bystander who broke the case. As leads continued to thin out, a break came through from an unlikely source. It was close to sunset when Sarah got the call from dispatch that a lead had come in. A man named Harold DeWitt, an unassuming bus driver for a small local transport company, claimed he had seen both David and Jessica at Burlington's downtown bus terminal 2 days earlier. "Harold DeWitt?" Greg said incredulously as they listened to the details. "The guy who's been driving the same town bus route for 30 years? The one who remembers every face he's ever seen?" "That one," Sarah replied dryly as they pulled into the small, outdated bus terminal. "And luckily for us, that photographic memory of his might finally come in handy." DeWitt was already waiting for them, nervously clutching his ball cap. He looked startled as Sarah approached him, though she quickly put on a calm and reassuring expression. "Mr. DeWitt," she said, extending her hand, "Detective Sarah Whitaker, I understand you believe you saw David Miller and Jessica Carter recently?" "I did," he said firmly, his hands wringing the cap as he spoke. "Both of them, they were here. Stood out to me because they didn't look like they were catching some tourist bus, looked like they were in a real hurry." "Did you hear anything they said? Notice what direction they left in?" Sarah asked, sensing his hesitation. "They bought tickets to Hartford, Connecticut," DeWitt replied. "That's the part of my job, checking tickets, seeing folks. They were fidgety, you know? Like they couldn't stand still, kept looking over their shoulders like somebody was tailing them." "Suitcases? Bags?" Greg asked, pulling out a notepad. "Yep," DeWitt answered confidently. "Big black duffel bag, and I don't know if it matters, but..." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Her hands weren't clean. The girl, the sister, Jessica, I think, her fingernails had this dark smudge under 'em. Maybe grease, maybe something else, but it didn't look normal." Sarah caught Greg's eye as they both processed the comment. People in transit wanting to disappear didn't drag attention-getting evidence with them, unless they were panicking. "Thank you, Mr. DeWitt," she said curtly. "You've been very helpful." As DeWitt walked off, leaving them with his cryptic observation, Greg spoke first. "So, we head to Hartford?" "We don't have a choice," Sarah replied. "This is the best lead we've got. If they've gone to ground there, we'll find them." The relentless search. The following morning, Burlington PD formally coordinated with Hartford law enforcement. While the paperwork and jurisdiction hurdles dragged on, Sarah couldn't sit still. Back in her office, maps sprawled out across her desk, she marked out every connecting transport hub and possible hiding spot. Greg leaned in, chewing on the end of a pen. "So you think they had a plan?" he asked finally. "What if this wasn't spur of the moment?" Maybe, Sarah muttered, tapping her pen against the map. But plans this sloppy mean one thing: panic. Look at the timeline. They stuck around Burlington for several days after Patricia disappeared. They didn't bolt immediately. If this were premeditated, they'd have been laying low from day one. David, withdrawing cash a week ago? That's desperation, not preparation. Greg nodded. So they're panicked, running out of money, cornered animals, dangerous. Exactly, Sarah said, the gears in her mind whirling. That means they're going to slip up sooner or later, but when they do, I don't want them disappearing into thin air again. The Connecticut connection. By the time Sarah and Greg arrived in Hartford, backed by local authorities, the search shifted into high gear. Surveillance footage from the Hartford station confirmed Harold DeWitt's claim. There they were, David and Jessica, looking far less polished than their old photographs suggested. Jessica wore a hoodie far too large for her, partially obscuring her face. David, meanwhile, kept nervously tapping the handle of the black duffel bag DeWitt described. The ticket line footage gave Sarah every confirmation she needed. "They're here," she said, narrowing her eyes at the grainy video. "And they're scared." Surveillance footage from the surrounding area eventually led detectives to a seedy-looking motel just off the highway, the kind of place where nobody asks questions if you pay cash. And David had indeed been paying cash. "This is it," Greg muttered, as their unmarked police car rolled into the dimly lit motel lot. Sarah adjusted her bulletproof vest, her hand brushing her service weapon. "I want them taken alive, Greg. No heroics. We need answers, not body bags." Greg smirked. "Noted. Let's see if they're feeling chatty tonight." With a team in place, they approached the creaky motel door. Inside, Sarah could already imagine the scene. 2 guilty faces, sweaty palms, and a web of lies unraveling at the seams. But one thing still gnawed at her gut as they moved in. Was this the end of the line, or had this tangled family mess just begun? The act of disposal. Every crime has a moment where things unravel, where panic takes over, and precision gives way to mistakes. For David Miller and Jessica Carter, that moment was buried in their choice of disposal. To Detective Sarah Whitaker, it didn't only speak to their desperation but also to their psychology. How a killer chooses to clean up or not clean up tells you everything about what kind of person they are. The first time Sarah sat down with Greg to piece together their disposal timeline, the room felt heavy, weighed down by the evidence bags stacked on one side of the table. Pictures of the suitcase, the knife, the gloves, and the trail of blood smeared across various parts of the Pine Brook woods lined the corkboard in front of them like puzzle pieces waiting to fit. "This isn't just panic," Sarah said, circling a pair of tire tracks in one of the photos. "This is panic mixed with arrogance. Whoever did this wasn't just trying to get rid of a body, they were trying to make a statement." Greg leaned back, chewing the end of a pen. "You think they wanted it found? 'Cause dumping a suitcase in the middle of woods that aren't too far from the town joggers use? That's not exactly inconspicuous." "Look at the suitcase," Sarah said, pointing to the photograph as she began pacing. "It's right on the edge of a ditch. They didn't bury her, they didn't burn anything. Dragged it just far enough where it could sit in the open without drawing too many eyes. If Ethan Calhoun hadn't been on his morning walk though, it could have been weeks before anyone stumbled on it." Greg grinned darkly. "So, lazy criminals, or confident ones?" "Confident," Sarah replied without hesitation, trying to avoid any inconvenience. "But ditching her that way, messy, incomplete, it's as if they wanted her gone, but the act itself disgusted them." She paused for a moment, her voice dropping lower. "Guilt shows up in weird ways." Greg shifted in his chair. "You think that's guilt talking?" "It fits," she muttered. They were meticulous enough to disfigure her face and remove identifying features, a controlled move, probably to burn time while they figured out what to do with the body. But then, look at how they handled the disposal. It's rushed. It's panicked. They didn't expect to be doing laundry at a crime scene. Mapping the mess. The forensic timeline built from the evidence painted a disturbing picture of that night. The blood found on the gloves near Pine Brook Woods told them everything they needed to know. David and Jessica had dragged that suitcase down the dirt path, stopping briefly because the weight was getting too much to bear. That's when David likely pulled off the gloves, dumping them carelessly into a bag that would later be found 15 yards from the body site. "Look at this," Eric from Forensics said, pointing during an evidence review meeting. "The streak marks on the bottom of the suitcase. They're scuffed and worn in areas consistent with dragging." "So they didn't carry her the whole way," Sarah said, hands on her hips. "They dragged her like baggage." Eric nodded grimly. "And not perfectly. The angle of these marks suggests they kept stopping, either to lift it over roots or adjust grip positions. They're humanizing her even less as they panic, Greg muttered under his breath. God, that's cold. Sarah tapped again on the photographs of the gloves. The gloves are bloodied, but look, they didn't stop to clean them. They dumped them during the act. Her eyebrows furrowed. This speaks to fatigue, rushing through things they probably thought they had time to plan. Whatever went wrong that night, it threw them into pure survival mode. The mistakes and missteps. By now the team was following evidence breadcrumbs down a harrowing trail. Each item left behind told a story of carelessness colliding with hubris. We've seen them try to clean up, Sarah said in another briefing as she pointed to a photograph of torn plastic bags laced with detergent streaks. Plastic bags suggest intent. They probably bought these for containing evidence or cleaning the scene, but somewhere between the plan and the execution they lost control. Look, there's detergent residue under their nails, on Jessica's specifically. Greg flipped through logistics receipts the team had managed to grab from local distributors. I'll bet anything they bought the supplies from somewhere out of town, but didn't think twice about how much would smell of chemicals. The bags weren't sealed properly either. Sarah crossed her arms, glaring at the collection of smudged photographs they'd gathered from previous scenes. They assumed throwing things across different areas would make us think random offenders. But this is staged carelessness. Staged enough to confuse amateurs, Greg added, but definitely not us. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from deeper analysis of the shallow tire tracks found tangled near branches at the scene. Forensic tire codes confirmed they matched David Miller's recently registered sedan, a quiet, reliable Toyota Corolla purchased months before Patricia was murdered. They used their own damn car to transport her, Sarah growled, shaking her head as the lab handed her the match confirmation. Even if they wiped down the interior, the impressions alone already prove intent. That car isn't just a vehicle anymore, it's the missing thread tying them together. And the duffel bag, Greg interjected. I know we don't have that physical link yet, but DeWitt saw them boarding with it. Bet you that's what held the weapons before ditching stuff piecemeal. A calculated dump. As she pieced it all together late at night in the quiet conference room, Sarah stared at the timeline forming on the board. It wasn't random at all. Though the execution of their plan had been flawed, David and Jessica acted with some shred of calculation. Each action, no matter how sloppy, carried weight. This wasn't their first attempt to solve the problem, Sarah said aloud to herself. Greg, still in the corner nursing cold coffee, looked up. How do you mean? He asked. They knew enough to mutilate her face, obscure identity, switch up disposal tools and locations. But they didn't finish it. Maybe they couldn't stand cleaning up their own mess, Greg offered. They probably hit their line when it came to thinking about getting caught versus fully disappearing her. Sarah leaned back in her chair. No, something about this whole pattern keeps nagging at me. Yes, they panicked. Yes, it's messy. But dumping her that shallowly in woods, dragging, suitcase snapping to show her pieces? She rubbed her temples. It's speaking to someone who wanted her gone but needed her mark to remain. That's twisted, Greg concluded, staring equally long at the mess on their crime board. And that's exactly why it's our job, Sarah snapped back. A shocking confession. The room was suffocatingly quiet, save for the ticking of the clock mounted high on the beige-colored wall. The air was thick with tension as Detective Sarah Whitaker sat across from David Miller. He wore a gray hoodie that sagged around his shoulders, his hair disheveled, his eyes hollow and bloodshot from hours without sleep, or perhaps from something deeper. Guilt, fear, regret. Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on it yet, but she knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. David was caught, cornered with no room to breathe. Every piece of evidence had led to this moment, and Sarah needed to hear him say it. Meanwhile, in another interrogation room next door, Jessica Carter sat shell-shocked with a public defender by her side. Sarah had made the deliberate choice to get David talking first. Men like him always broke under pressure. They just needed the right push. All right, David, Sarah began, her voice steady but firm. Let's not waste each other's time. We both know why you're here. You can keep sitting there in silence, or you can start talking and help me understand what happened. Maybe, just maybe I can help you if you do, but it's your call. David stared down at his hands, his fingers twitching nervously. He swallowed hard. When he looked up at Sarah, his face barely masked the storm brewing underneath. He began, his voice trembling. I didn't mean for things to go this far. Sarah tilted her head slightly, watching him like a hawk. She leaned forward, signaling that he had her full attention. What didn't you mean, David? Go ahead, say it, this is your chance. David inhaled sharply, running his shaking hands through his hair. It wasn't supposed to happen, all right? None of it. I just lost it. I couldn't take it anymore. Take what exactly? Sarah pressed, her tone razor sharp. Couldn't take Patricia? Couldn't take her standing up to you? Opposing you? His face twisted into something between anger and despair. He slammed his hand against the table, causing Sarah's pen to roll slightly to the side. The officer standing in the corner shifted his weight, ready to jump in, but Sarah raised a calming hand. She wouldn't stop, David muttered, his teeth gritted. She kept pushing and pushing. Every single day, Patricia. She had a way of making me feel like nothing. Like I was a failure. She wouldn't let it go. She threatened to leave, to ruin me. She wanted to take everything we had left, what little we had. David's voice cracked. For a moment he looked like he was about to cry, but there was something sinister leaking through the facade of his breakdown. It wasn't just regret, it was the fury of a man still trying to justify the unspeakable. So what? Sarah said coldly, crossing her arms as she leaned back in her chair. You decided to kill her because you couldn't handle her honesty? Because she expected more from you? David shook his head violently. No, it wasn't like that. I didn't plan it. I swear to God, I didn't plan it. We were arguing, just another fight. She called me useless, said I'd ruined her life, said I was dragging her and Jessica down like an anchor. She said she wanted me gone. And then what, David? Sarah's tone was calm, though inside her blood was boiling. She knew this dance too well, the way criminals fumbled to frame their violence as an accident. What did you do to Patricia? David dropped his head into his hands, his voice muffled by his fingers. I grabbed her. I grabbed her by the throat and I didn't think. She kept yelling, kept thrashing, and I told her to shut up. I told her to stop, and then he looked up at Sarah, tears streaming down his face now. It all just stopped. She went limp. For a moment the room seemed frozen. Sarah let his words hang in the air, watching him squirm under their weight. She leaned forward again, her voice even lower now. And Jessica? She asked. Where does she come into this? David sniffed, wiping his nose with the sleeve of his hoodie. She walked in, after it happened. She freaked out, started screaming, but then his voice faltered, his gaze darting around the room like he was searching for an escape. She said we had to take care of it, that no one would believe it was an accident, that they'd think we both did it. Sarah's gut churned. So Jessica helped you cover up Patricia's murder? David hesitated, then nodded slowly. She got the plastic. She helped me clean up the blood. We didn't know what else to do. We panicked. Did you dismember her? Sarah asked bluntly, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. David looked up at her, his face as pale as a ghost, his lips trembled, and then the faintest hint of a nod confirmed what Sarah already knew. It was me, he croaked. I thought if I broke it up, if I kept pieces small, they wouldn't find her, or they wouldn't know it was her. Sarah clenched her jaw. She wanted to erupt, to scream at this man for what he had done, but she held herself together. And the suitcase? Leaving her in the woods? You thought that was the perfect idea, huh? David shook his head frantically. Jessica came up with that part. She said no one would look there. She said we could act like she'd just left. She just left, Sarah repeated, letting the absurdity of the statement sink into the room. She leaned back in her chair again, leveling her gaze directly at David. Right, the loving sister and the devoted husband, the perfect little conspirators, huh? Jessica breaks under pressure. In the next room, Jessica Carter was spiraling. Unlike David, she didn't bother trying to hold it together. Her legs bounced beneath the table, her arms crossed tightly as if bracing herself against the cold, or maybe the storm of her regret. When Sarah finally entered the room, Jessica avoided eye contact, her hair falling messily over her face. Sarah set a file down on the table with a deliberate clap, making Jessica flinch. You've got one chance to tell the truth, Jessica, Sarah said sharply. One, because David's already talking, and believe me, he's not painting himself as the only bad guy here. Jessica's head snapped up, her watery eyes wide with panic. He said something? She stammered. Oh, he sure did, Sarah replied, crossing her arms. Said you helped him, said you cleaned up the blood, said you came up with the genius idea to stash your sister's body in a suitcase like last season's wardrobe. Is that true? Jessica was trembling now. He made me do it. He said he'd kill me too if I didn't help. I didn't know what else to do. Sarah chuckled darkly. That's interesting because he's telling me it was all your idea, that you walked in and started calling the shots. So what's the truth here, Jessica? Who's lying, him or you? Jessica's breath came in short, shallow bursts. Tears streamed down her face as she finally broke. It wasn't my fault. I didn't want this. I didn't mean for her to die. I didn't mean for any of it, she cried, collapsing into loud sobs. Sarah stared at her for a moment before leaning forward, her voice steely and unforgiving. You didn't mean for her to die? Or you didn't mean for us to catch you? Jessica sobbed harder, unable or unwilling to answer. The horrific truth emerges. By the end of the interrogations, the full, chilling picture had been painted. David had killed Patricia in a fit of rage, but Jessica, whether out of fear or twisted loyalty to her brother-in-law, had stepped in to help cover up the crime. Together, they had dismembered her body, packed her into the suitcase, and left her in the woods, thinking they could leave their dirty secret behind. What they hadn't counted on was that their mess would follow them, or that their crime would haunt them so deeply they couldn't outrun it. The truth revealed. The conference room at Burlington PD was a tense scene of collected evidence, sleepless detectives, and the quiet hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. Detective Sarah Whitaker, standing at the head of the table, had spent countless hours assembling the puzzle of Patricia Miller's tragic end. Now, with David Miller's and Jessica Carter's confessions in hand, the picture was almost complete. But the truth, as it always does, was so much darker than anyone had anticipated. Sarah's voice cracked the room's silence. All right, let's go over this step by step. I want every detail accounted for. No loose ends. Greg Yates sat on the opposite side of the table, a styrofoam cup of coffee in one hand and a pen in the other, flipping through pages of evidence. His face was grim. Well, we've got a timeline now, but damn if it isn't the most twisted family drama I've seen in years. Sarah crossed her arms. Start with David's confession. What's his version of the truth? Greg exhaled and began reading from his notes. David claims the fight started after dinner the night Patricia died. Says it was over finances, big surprise there. Patricia had finally had enough. She told him she was filing for divorce. Said she was tired of him draining her savings. Sarah narrowed her eyes, pacing in front of the whiteboard covered in notes, photographs, and diagrams of the crime scene. Filing for divorce, that tracks. According to Wendy, Patricia had been talking about leaving him for weeks. Let me guess, he couldn't handle being cut off? Greg nodded. Exactly, he claims Patricia told him he'd be out on the street if he didn't get his act together, called him a failure, said she regretted ever marrying him. You know, classic enraged spouse stuff. Sarah stopped pacing, gripping the edge of the table. And that's when he snapped. Yep, Greg said flatly. Said he grabbed her by the throat, told her to shut up. He claims it wasn't premeditated, just heat of the moment. But here's where it gets murkier. He said Jessica walked in while... Greg hesitated, his lip curling. While he was choking her. Sarah's fingers tightened on the table edge, her jaw clenching. And Jessica... What? Decides to help him instead of calling for help instead of doing the human thing? Greg raised an eyebrow. According to David, she starts screaming initially, but then calms down enough to tell him they can't let anyone find out, says the cops won't believe it was an accident, that they'd both end up in prison. Sarah scoffed, shaking her head. Prison? That's her first thought? Not the fact her sister is dead on the floor? Greg shrugged, flipping another page. Apparently logic didn't make it into that house. David says Jessica suggested cleaning up the mess and splitting the responsibility. Splitting responsibility, Sarah repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. More like doubling the guilt. Greg tapped his pen against the table. Oh, it gets better. David's truth versus Jessica's truth. Later that day, Sarah sat across from Jessica Carter in another interrogation room. This time Jessica looked small, hunched over, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. Gone was the defensive, manipulative younger sister Sarah had first met. Instead, Jessica was unraveling, a human thread coming apart. Jessica, Sarah started, her tone sharp but tired. David laid it all out for us. He says you helped him, came up with the plan, told him where to hide her. Is that what happened? Jessica's eyes flicked upward, shimmering with unshed tears. He's lying! I didn't have a choice. You didn't have a choice? Sarah repeated mockingly, slamming her palm flat on the table. You know how many murderers say that, Jessica? You had lots of choices, like calling the police, like screaming for help, like walking away. Jessica burst into tears, her words tumbling out in broken sobs. You don't understand. He said he'd kill me too. He said if I didn't help him he'd tell everyone I was in on it from the beginning. He made it sound like I'd go to prison no matter what I did. Sarah tilted her head, watching Jessica carefully. And you expect me to believe that you were so scared, so terrified of David Miller, that you willingly helped him clean up his wife, your sister's murder? You expect me to believe you just stood there and went along for the ride? Jessica sniffled, her voice small. I didn't know what else to do. Sarah leaned forward, her voice cold, calculating. Here's the thing, Jessica. I don't think you were scared. I think you hated Patricia. I think she made you feel small, useless, like the freeloader she accused you of being. And when she went after David, your little safety net, you decided it was time for her to go. Jessica's eyes widened in horror, shaking her head violently. No, that's not true. But here's the kicker, Sarah interrupted, her voice rising. You stayed, Jessica. You helped him. You bought the cleaning supplies, you cut the damn plastic, and you didn't just stand there, you planned this. No, Jessica screamed, her voice cracking. It wasn't like that. It wasn't my idea. I just did what he told me to do. Then why were your fingerprints found on the knife, Jessica? Sarah asked, her voice razor sharp. Why were you the one David says packed her into the suitcase? He put the blame squarely on you, and you know what? His confession matches the evidence. Jessica froze, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. The horror unfolds. Later, Sarah and Greg sat down to compile the final truth, an ugly, incomplete mosaic pieced together from two unreliable perspectives. Here's how it played out, Sarah began, tapping a finger on the timeline. David killed Patricia during the argument. Jessica walks in. Whether she's scared or plain opportunistic, she makes the fatal choice to help. Together, they clean up the blood, dismember the body to make it easier to move, and, here's the real killer detail. Greg raised an eyebrow. Let me guess. The suitcase? Exactly. It's Jessica's suitcase, Sarah confirmed. The blood residue matches the fabric from the suitcase found at the crime scene. It wasn't David's idea. It was Jessica's property, Jessica's involvement. And the woods? Greg added. They dragged the suitcase out there together, but the car, those tire tracks belonged to David's Corolla. The transport details were his choice, Sarah replied. They thought dumping it in the woods would buy them time, but instead, they left us a trail of clues. A web of lies. The final moments of Patricia Miller's life had been stolen by a husband who was desperate and a sister who was toxic. The truth, revealed through shaky confessions and insurmountable evidence, painted an almost Shakespearean tale of betrayal, greed, and misplaced trust. David killed her with his hands, Sarah said, jotting down their findings. Jessica killed her with her choices. And they both killed her with their lies, Greg added grimly. End of the road for these two. Sarah gave a small nod. Justice doesn't undo what happened, but it buries the lies with the truth. Dark motives. The interrogation room had become a war zone of conflicting truths and tangled motives. Detective Sarah Whitaker sat in silence, studying David Miller intently. His face was pale, his lips quivering as though he wanted to speak but couldn't muster the courage. The weight of Patricia's murder hung like a storm cloud over the small, windowless room. The evidence led here. The confessions filled in the details. Yet nothing explained the why. The deep, poisonous root of their dark intentions. That was what she wanted. No, needed. So, let me get this straight, David, Sarah finally said, her tone calm but underscored with a sharp edge. You're telling me all of this happened because of some fight about money? Because Patricia wanted to divorce you and wouldn't finance your poor life decisions anymore? She tilted her head, her stare piercing into him. That's what you want people to believe? That's your excuse? David flinched, his hands trembling as he wrung them together. It wasn't just about the money, he suddenly blurted out, his voice cracking. It was everything. She had been on my back for months. Nitpicking, controlling, making me feel like I was nothing. She was going to humiliate me, take everything away. Everything? Sarah asked, leaning forward now, her voice a razor-thin thread of patience. What did you even have left, David? Let's not kid ourselves here. Your business was gone. Your bank account was drained. If she was paying all the bills, what's this everything you're talking about? She knew about Jessica! He yelled suddenly, slamming his fists against the table. The outburst filled the room, and for a brief moment silence followed, a silence so thick it felt suffocating. Sarah's eyes narrowed. What exactly did she know about Jessica? She asked, her tone suddenly colder. The pen in her hand stopped mid-tap against the notebook as she watched David squirm in his seat. She found out about the texts, David muttered, lowering his voice so it was barely above a whisper. He hunched his shoulders as though trying to shield himself from the weight of his own words. Patricia had gone through my phone. She saw the messages between me and Jess. What kind of messages are we talking about, David? Sarah pressed, her voice both calm and commanding. David hesitated, licking his lips nervously. They weren't explicit or anything, but Patricia figured it out. She said she knew something was going on. That's when she lost it. Called me disgusting. Said it was bad enough I'd ruined our marriage, but now she accused me of crossing a line with Jessica. Sarah paused, letting his words settle before narrowing her eyes. So, was she right, David? Did you cross a line with Jessica? David's face turned scarlet as he shook his head violently. No, it wasn't like that. It wasn't physical. It was just talking. Jess was the only one who understood what I was going through. Patricia was always so critical. Jessica, she listened. She cared. Sarah arched a skeptical brow. Cared enough for Patricia to notice? That kind of emotional affair isn't as innocent as you think, David, and let me guess, Jessica played right into it. David exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping. Jess hated Patricia. Anytime I vented to her about our fights, she'd tell me I deserved better, that Patricia didn't appreciate me, and maybe— His eyes dropped to the table, voice softening to a whisper. Maybe I started to believe it. Jessica's version of the truth. Meanwhile, in another interrogation room, Jessica Carter was unraveling. The defiant smirk she had worn earlier was long gone, replaced by tear-streaked cheeks and jittering hands. Detective Greg Yates, unflinching but notably less patient than Sarah, leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. You want me to believe this had nothing to do with you, Jessica? Greg asked, his tone sharp and accusatory. I've got your fingerprints on practically everything. You and David weren't just covering up Patricia's murder. No, you two were way too involved from the start for this to just be a cover-up. So tell me again why this wasn't your idea. Jessica grimaced, avoiding his gaze by glancing down at her lap. I hated her, okay? Is that what you want me to say? I hated Patricia. She treated me like trash. Like some unwanted guest in her stupid perfect house. Interesting, Greg said, pacing now. And your solution to being treated like trash was to team up with her husband? That's a little on the nose, don't you think? I didn't team up with him, Jessica snapped, her voice sharp with desperation. I didn't plan this. I didn't kill her. But you didn't stop it either, Greg shot back coldly. You didn't call the police. You grabbed cleaning supplies, bought plastic, and helped stuff your own sister into a suitcase. You didn't just help. You encouraged him, didn't you? Jessica's face contorted as she burst into tears. She always thought she was better than me, she sobbed. She wanted me out of her life. She said I was a failure, that I was ruining everything. She said I'd never be successful like her. Do you know what it's like to live like that every single day? To be compared to her over and over, always being the screw-up? Greg folded his arms. So what? Killing her was supposed to fix all of that? Make you worthy of respect? Make you the better sister after all? Jessica shook her head frantically. I didn't mean for it to happen. I thought if she was gone, maybe things would be better. For me. For David. But it wasn't supposed to— Her voice cracked, the admission hanging there between them. Greg leaned closer, lowering his voice. But it did happen, Jessica. She's dead. You helped make sure of that. And no matter how much you try to spin this, all I see is a lot of self-pity and exactly zero remorse. The intersection of greed and betrayal. Later that night, Sarah and Greg met in the dimly lit conference room, piecing together the twisted puzzle of David and Jessica's motives. They both had reasons to want Patricia out of the picture, Greg said, tossing Jessica's confession transcript onto the table. David saw her as an obstacle, someone who could humiliate him and cut him off financially. Jessica saw her as an enemy, someone who reminded her day in and day out of all her failures. And the two of them fed off each other, Sarah added, standing with her arms crossed, staring at the threads of evidence pinned to the wall. David needed someone to stroke his ego and make him feel less pathetic. Jessica needed someone to poison her mind further against Patricia. Put the two of them together, and you've got a recipe for murder. Greg nodded grimly. Sounds about right. David might have been the one to actually kill her, but let's not pretend Jessica wasn't right there, egging him on. And what about after? Sarah asked, glancing at the images of the suitcase, the gloves, the knife. They still had a choice. They didn't have to lay her out in that forest like trash. They didn't have to mutilate her, carve her up like some object. Dark motives make dark choices, Greg said bitterly. And these two? They're nothing but cowards hiding behind their own selfishness. Sarah nodded, her jaw tight. Patricia deserved better than this. The final verdict. The courthouse was packed, the air dense with anticipation and dread as the jury filed back into the courtroom. The oak-paneled walls seemed to close in on everyone as all eyes turned to the foreperson of the jury, nervously clutching the small slip of paper that would deliver justice, or a haunting lack of it. Detective Sarah Whitaker sat stoically at the back of the courtroom, her arms crossed tightly as she avoided direct eye contact with either defendant. From the prosecution's table, the assistant district attorney adjusted their glasses and glanced at Sarah, exchanging a subtle nod. This was the culmination of months of relentless investigation, a tangled knot of lies and betrayal finally unraveled before 12 ordinary citizens tasked with rendering judgment. On trial were two different people with radically different motives, yet their fates were tied together like prisoners on the same sinking ship. David Miller, hunched over in his ill-fitting suit, couldn't seem to lift his eyes from the table. His previously sharp, deflective bravado had crumbled weeks ago, replaced by the hollow visage of a man who had gambled everything and lost. Seated beside him, Jessica Carter refused to look at anyone, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her shiny, court-appointed pen, an object she'd been nervously fiddling with for the entire trial. "Will the defendants please rise?" the judge said in a deep voice that echoed through the room like thunder. The silence that followed was so absolute that Sarah was certain everyone could hear the pounding of her heartbeat. David stood first. His legs wobbled like those of a man who already knew his fate. Jessica followed reluctantly, stealing a quick glance at her defense attorney, who avoided her gaze entirely. A jury's decision. Across the aisle, Greg Yates, sharp in his dress shirt but nearly vibrating with tension, leaned over to whisper to Sarah. "All this work. You think they'll get it right?" he murmured, not taking his eyes off the jury. "They'd better," Sarah replied flatly, not turning her head. Her grip tightened on the armrest. "If they can't tell guilt from that mountain of evidence, I don't think I'll sleep for a month." "Yeah, let's hope they're smarter than David and Jessica were," Greg added with a sardonic grin that faded as quickly as it came. "Shh," Sarah hissed, as the foreperson cleared their throat. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense haircut, read the verdict aloud in a voice that was steady but tinged with electric tension. "In the matter of the charges against David Miller, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, hushed but heavy. David sank visibly, his body seeming to collapse inward as the reality settled over him. His attorney whispered something in his ear, but he didn't react. He didn't even blink. Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. One down. The foreperson continued, "In the matter of the charges against Jessica Carter, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of accessory to murder and of tampering with evidence." Unlike David, Jessica erupted in a flood of emotion, tears streaming down her face as she whispered inaudible pleas to her attorney. She shook her head furiously, mouthing repeated "No, no, no," as if denial alone could rewrite the juror's decision. "Order!" the judge barked, slamming his gavel, but Sarah barely registered the sound. Her attention was locked squarely on Jessica, whose weeping quickly devolved into an unhinged sobbing that echoed across the courtroom, filling the ears of everyone present with a pathetic reminder of the choices that had led her to this moment. Sentencing day. Several weeks later, the sentencing phase exposed the final twists of the knife. David Miller stood motionless as the judge sentenced him to life without parole, narrowly avoiding the death penalty. His defense had argued for lenience, painting him as a man pushed to the brink by finances and marital strife, but the brutality of his crime, and Sarah's rock-solid investigation, left no room for sympathy. "It is the decision of this court," the judge intoned, his voice heavy with the weight of justice, "that David Miller will serve the maximum penalty allowed by law for the heinous and premeditated murder of Patricia Miller." David didn't flinch. He seemed frozen. No protests, no words, no spark of defiance. There was only the faint, soulless flicker in his eyes of someone who knew he'd never breathe free air again. Jessica Carter, by contrast, couldn't stay silent during her sentencing. When the judge handed down her 10-year prison sentence for accessory to murder and tampering with evidence, she burst into hysterics. 10 years? She shrieked, her shackled wrists clinking against the wooden table. "You can't do this! She was my sister! I didn't kill her! I didn't—" "Enough!" the judge bellowed, his patience clearly drained. "Miss Carter, your actions, though not the cause of Patricia Miller's death, demonstrated a blatant disregard for the laws of this state and the dignity of human life. This court has shown you mercy today in sentencing you to 10 years. Do not mistake that for vindication." As deputies escorted Jessica away, she muttered incoherent complaints between sobs, casting one last desperate look back at the courtroom. If she was seeking pity, none of the stern faces awaiting justice, including Sarah's, offered it. Aftermath and reflection. Outside the courthouse that day, Sarah and Greg stood on the courthouse steps, bathed in the harsh glare of news camera lights. Reporters shoved microphones toward them, shouting questions like a frenzy of hornets. "Detective Whitaker, what do you think of the verdict? Was justice served today? Do you believe Jessica Carter deserved a harsher sentence?" Sarah held up a hand, signaling for silence before speaking with measured calm. "Justice is never perfect, but it was served today. Patricia Miller deserved better than what happened to her, and while we can't undo her loss, we've ensured the people responsible will never harm anyone else again." Greg chimed in, adding his sharp, no-nonsense tone. "This case reminded us of just how deep betrayal can run, even in families, but it also showed the strength of a community coming together to demand answers. Patricia's voice may have been silenced, but justice spoke for her today." The reporters' questions continued to fly, but Sarah had said all she needed to. She turned away from the cameras, walking down the courthouse steps toward her car. Greg followed, his usual snark noticeably absent. "You okay?" Greg asked after a long silence. "I will be," Sarah replied softly, looking out toward the horizon. "This job, sometimes it feels like all we ever do is dig graves for ghosts, but at least this time, the ghosts can rest." Greg nodded, his hands in his pockets. "Yeah, let's hope the next one doesn't cut so deep." And so, with the final verdict delivered, Burlington could begin to heal. The small town would forever be haunted by the memory of Patricia Miller, the woman whose death revealed the dark and twisted hearts of the very people closest to her. But for Sarah, it was another case closed, another battle won in a never-ending war for the truth.